Okay, so welcome back, everybody, from all the Chag of Sukkot, Shemini Atzeres. It's nice to be back. We were on Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, further down on the daf, but the last year, I think there was I sensed some uncertainty. There was a little confusion, maybe, of understanding of the Gemara. So I think the best thing is to start from the Mishnah again. We'll go fairly quickly. And we'll get into the Sugya Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, the Mishnah at the top, a couple lines from the top. We'll go through the Mishnah and then we'll move from there. This way, at least, we're starting something new. Okay, so a refresher. Hamafkid Peres Esel Chavero. If someone leaves as a mashkin or just as a holding for a holding period, Peres by his friend. Even if they're starting to spoil, lo yigo behem. This is the Tanna Kama says that you shouldn't touch them. You should just leave them in their in the status that they are, even if they're starting to rot or spoil. Reb Shimon Gamliel says no. Mochem ipnei bezdin. You go to bezdin and you say, we have to sell these. They're going to spoil. There'll be a monetary loss, and we know that one Jew always cares for the mammon and the possessions of his friend, and therefore we must sell them. It's like a shavas aveda. If something's worth $100 and you salvage it, you're literally giving him $100. So the shavas aveda. So the Rosh Gamliel takes the position that, again, this is very plain and simple without any sort of permutation or combination. That if you start seeing it getting spoiled, what do you do? So the Tanna Kama, usually Reb Meir, says you don't touch it. Reb Shimon Gamliel says you immediately go to Bezdin and say, Bezdin, I want to sell this so that we can preserve the value to the owner. Now Rashi expands the definition avudim al yidei akravim or rikuvim. He says either because of rats or mice, in other words, it's being infested, or because in fact there is the food itself is starting to spoil. I mean, every food has a shelf life. So if it starts to spoil, then what do you do? So those are the two reasons. Lo yiga behem lamachram, according to Tanna Kama, v'tam first b'Gemara, and then we're going to get into the Gemara in more detail. But you don't sell them, you don't do anything. So that's the basic machloikis between the Tanna Kama and Rosh Gamliel. Frek the Gemara my Tama. What is the reason for the Tanna Kama who says lo yiga behem? Okay, we get Rosh Gamliel that you should sell it because you're salvaging the property. But what's the rationale why the Tanna Kama says lo yiga behem? You should leave them alone. So here we have a machlokas amaroim, Amar Rav Kana, and we said that Rav Kana says Adam Rotzer b'kav shalom metisha kav mishal chaveru. If you recall, we said that since the mashkin is presumably something personal to the mafkid, therefore, with the general rule we have in Shas that a person prefers a kav, so a small measure of his own produce, than 9 kavim of his chavero. In other words, you have a choice of something that's homegrown, and even if it's only a kav, or something that is store bought and it's 9 times as large, tisha kavim. He'd rather have the kav that he himself developed or planted. So what does that mean? So the Tanna Kama, what it means in the Mishnah is that presumably it's talking about kav shelo, and the Mishnah says, you know what? He rather that the mashkin that he's giving to his friend of 1 kav be preserved instead of selling it and taking the money and buying 9 kavim in the store. So that's okay. So that's the pshat in Rav Kana. Rav Kana says we're dealing with something personal to the individual, and he wants to keep it. So he wouldn't want to sell it, even if he can get 9 times as much produce for the same, for the dollar's worth of that same item. That's Rav Kana Shita. And that the klal, by the way, is a klal in the Shas that is universally viewed. That Adam writes in Kav Shalom, Matisha Kav Mishal Chaveru. Now, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, another Amora, he says, no, that's not the reason why you don't trade it in. You don't trade it in. So we began to explain that if you have let's say I live in New York, and I have a farm in upstate, let's say in Connecticut as an example, and that farm produces a lot of produce. So I'm allowed to take food stuff um, that I have in my possession in New York and say, I'm giving truma and maser from that produce in Connecticut, but I'm giving it from what I have in my storeroom in New York. So I'm giving truma and maser in New York for Connecticut, and therefore all of the produce in Connecticut is now mutter be'achila b'hana, because I've given truma and maser. What truma maser have I given? That which I've given to my friend to hold. So the hamafkid that he's given to his friend to hold is the truma and maser that he's using to pater, so to speak, to free up all of the produce in Connecticut. And now that produce is mutter to be sold to Jews, to anyone, because it's no longer tevel. It's now completely truma and maser given. So that's Rav Nachman Shitas. Rav Nachman is the one who says Chashinan, the reason why you can't do anything with the produce that he gave to the mafkid, to the nifgad, Shema Asan HaMafkid Truma Omasa Amakamaka. He announced that which I gave to my friend Reuven to hold is Truma and Maser. And so what can the nifgad do with it? He can't do anything with it. It's Truma and Maser.
What was excuse me, Rabbi, what was the point of temporarily giving it to a friend? He could have done what you normally do with Truma and Meiser. You give it to Cohen and so on and so forth.
Right. So that's a good question. But the sequence, Jay, was where he had some food in his possession and he was about to go off on a short trip. And he said to his friend, Baruch, do me a favor, hold on to this food for me. Okay, it's food that I want to have, I want to keep, but I don't want to leave it in my own house. You hold it on to me. So when he gave it to him, he didn't give it to him as Truma and Maser. He gave it to him as regular food to hold on. But Chashinam, what we're afraid of, says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, is that he is going to say, you know what? That food I gave Baruch, I'm making that Truma and Maser. So in other words, after the fact, after he gave it to Baruch, he says, it's Truma and Maser. And I want to pater my food in Connecticut. So Baruch is now holding Truma and Maser, and he's limited in what he can do with it. So it's not as if he gave him the Truma and Maser. He gave it to him as regular food, like anything else. But then he thought to himself, you know what? I can do Truma and Maser on this food and make my whole, I have an offer for, a big offer for my produce in Connecticut. You know how I'm going to sell it? I'm going to sell it by taking this food, making it Truma and Maser. Therefore, that food is now totally available. Let's just say I'm making up a story, and then he can take all that food and give it away or sell it for a good price or whatever it is in Connecticut, because there's a big fair going on and he wants to be able to move all the produce. And here's the opportunity. He's not going to sell tevel. He's not going to sell the food in Connecticut when it isn't Truman and Maser, because he's a religious guy. He doesn't want to give away. He doesn't want to make people be over on the Isser of tevel. So he takes the food that he has in his possession, gives Truma and Maser, and therefore the food in Connecticut is now totally.
Yeah, so why is he allowed to retroactively take food that wasn't taken off the field or in his other field and suddenly change its status when in fact he had no intention of doing that when
So there is a machlokes among the Rishonim as to whether or not that is appropriate, or whether you can do that. And according to the Shita, that we say that you're allowed to do it. Not everybody universally agrees that is something can be done. I agree, that's okay, it's a given. So we said at the time that there is that machlokes. So according to the Shita, which seems to be well received, it seems to be well accepted, that you can give Truma and Meiser from one food to another without necessarily having them had been combined. Again, not everybody agrees, but according to the view that you can do that, you can then give the Truma Maser. Now, you can argue, well, that will open up all kinds of improprieties if a person can do that. And that's suspect. That is a little bit of an issue. But according to those Manda Amrim who say you can do it, I guess they're not as worried that there will be some kind of blowback or something. So you can take truma and meiser and say that's the truma and meiser for the produce that I have over there, and it's acceptable. So we're going according to that view that is acceptable. So even if he didn't have a havamin in the beginning to do it, but once he had the havamin, once he said it, and he said this produce is truma and meiser for my produce in Connecticut, then we have to accept that. We have to say, according to this mandama, we have to say that's a legitimate statement, and therefore it all comes back to our Mishnah. That's why Hamafgid Perzes Chavero, so Nachma Yitzchak Chayshina and Shema Osan Hamafgid Truma Masa Makam Acher, and therefore don't do anything without talking to him first, because you may violate the condition that he put on it, which is to make it Truma Masa. And if you're going to do something with it to help him, you're going to wind up selling Truma and Masa maybe to a Yisrael, and that of course becomes a problem because the Yisrael can't eat Truma Masa.
But this is basically all done in his head, and the
Right.
friend that's holding it has no idea what's in his head.
That's correct. He hasn't articulated. That's why we take the extra step of saying, don't do something you weren't told to do. So if Nachman Yitzchak says, were you told to give it away? No. Chashinan, we're afraid of that may happen. So don't you touch it and don't you do anything with it. So two different views, Rav Kana's view and Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's view. Okay, now, those are the two explanations in the Tanakama of our Mishnah. Comes now the Gemara and said Mesave. Now I'll ask you a kasha from a brisa. Okay, we have the following brisa, which we're now going to look at. Hamafkid Perish Esel Chavero. This is a different brisa, not our Mishnah. If someone gives Perish to his friend to hold, Harizeh lo yiga behem. He's not supposed to touch them. So this parallels the words in our Mishnah, and that brisa goes on to say, Leficha, therefore, in other words, because you are not supposed to touch them, Lefikach balabais osna osa truma umasa amakam acher. So that brisa is worded in the following fashion: don't, if someone gives you produce to hold, don't you do anything with it other than leave it in your storeroom. Therefore, lefikach, the balabais, the mafkid, the one who gave the fruit, osa truma masa amakam acher. In other words, that Mishnah is amplifying what we have said here, that if I give you something to hold, you must keep it without doing anything to give me the right to give truma and maser on food that I have in Connecticut. That's what that brisa, so that brisa is rewording what we just said, but is saying it as an emphatic statement, because you're not allowed to do anything with it. Lefikach, therefore, I have rights to it, and therefore I can give truma and maser. Okay, so that's really what we have been saying in Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, but that's a brisa that says exactly that. Now, having said that, says the Gemara as follows: Bishloim Rav Kana, according to Rav Kana, who says a person would rather have kav shelo than tisha kav shel chavero, hanadik tani lefikach. I understand perfectly why he said lefikach. Why? Because Rav Kana says that a person wants his own kav more than 9 kavim of his friend. Therefore, you're not allowed to do anything with it. Therefore, the owner is free to give truma and meiser from that produce, because he knows that no one is going to touch it because it's kav shelo. So once it's kav shelo, you don't want to touch it. Now I can do what I want with it, and I want to give truma meiser. So the bishloma on Rav Kana is, of course, I understand the lefikach in the brisa, because the lefikach is the outcome of what he intrinsically has told the nifkad, don't touch it. It's mine. I like my kav. Don't touch it. And because you can't touch it, I can give anything. I can give truma maser. So lefikach, according to him, makes sense. Okay, we can buy that. Ela Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, but according to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, who says the whole reason why you hold on to it and don't do anything is because you can give truma, my lefikach. So what's the question? The question is that the lefikach is upside down because you want to prove and say that he can give truma a meiser, and essentially what you're saying, this brisa is saying, don't you dare take that produce and give it somewhere else because he can give truma meiser, therefore he can give truma meiser. That doesn't make sense. The lefikach should be based on something else. In other words, because you're doing such and such, therefore lefikach, you're free to give truma meiser. But how can you say that the whole reason why you're supposed to hold on to it is because you should give truma meiser, therefore you can't give truma meiser? That's redundant. In other words, the lefikach doesn't make sense in that context because you've already said the underlying reason why you're not allowed to touch it is because of truma and meiser. So what's pshat in the lefikach? In other words, the Gemara wants to make everything even. The Gemara wants you to understand that when we say something, and then we say the outcome is such that one fits with the other. So in Rav Kana, it fits because you don't touch it because of kav shalo, and therefore you can give truma meiser. But you can't say, well, you're not allowed to give truma meiser, therefore you're not allowed to give truma meiser. That lefikach doesn't hang together. That's the Gemara's kasha. So that's the Gemara's kasha. Is bishloima according to Rav Kana? I get it because he comes to lefikach. My lefikach. What's the lefikach? Emphit the Gemara. So the Gemara says, we're going to smooth this out and we're going to explain. Hachi ka'amar. This is the explanation. Hashta de omer l'Rabbanan lo nizavin. Now that what does the brisa say? The brisa says, lo yiga b'hem. Don't touch them. Okay, so we interpret don't touch them lo nizavin, right? Don't sell them. You can't do anything. Why? The chashinan, because we're afraid something may have gone on wrong. In other words, there may be something that the owner wants to do with this property, but it says it in a general form. Therefore, lefikach balabais also truma masa amakam acher. So he wants to twist the words a little bit and say that since the brisa says and he did not expressly state because of truma and meiser. So basically he's saying, don't touch them. You're not allowed to touch them. I don't want you to touch them. Therefore, since you're not allowed to sell them or touch them, lefikach, I can go ahead and give truma meiser. It's kind of a little bit of a weak answer, but at least it doesn't directly show a stira, in other words, a controversy by saying, you can't give truma meiser, therefore you can't give truma meiser. So in other words, we go away from that and we say that you shouldn't sell them. So now the whole principle is that you're not supposed to sell what I gave you as a mashkin. Then the Gemara says, okay, now that you can't sell it, regardless of the reason, it doesn't articulate, but now that you can't sell it, lefikach, I can give truma meiser l'makam acher. So it's a little bit of a weak answer, but it does give some kind of an answer from Nachman bar Yitzchak that doesn't completely contradict each other, like we asked in the question. So the Gemara says, okay, it's all right that lefikach can actually come out even according to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So okay, so in a way we've now reconciled both Manda Amrim, Rav Kana and Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, and we say that in the Mishnah they each give a different reason why you're not supposed to touch it once you get it. According to Rav Kana, because of kav shalo, and according to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, because you're not allowed to sell it. You're not allowed to sell something that you weren't told to sell. So in other words, it's more like a blanket statement. I gave you something. I didn't tell you to sell it. Don't sell it. Therefore, because you can't sell it, because I didn't give you permission, therefore, you can give truma meiser from this produce to another place, right? So in other words, it's a little bit more of an intuitive kind of reason. Rav Kana reason is right out there, up front. Kab shalom, matisha kab shel chavero. Rav Nachman's is a little bit more, in his sleeve. In other words, he didn't articulate it as clearly as Rav Kana did, and therefore we extrapolate lefikach. He cannot touch it, and the owner can give truma ma'aser.
Excuse me,
Rashi, Kav
Excuse me.
shelo chaviv alav ad yad she'omo behem, because he did the work. The kav sheyishalo mehem, who wrote it, he runs it better. Metisha kav acher sheyikach b'demeim in yimacha. And that's the classic example of a person who prefers his own handiwork, even if it isn't necessarily as nice or expensive as something that you can be store bought, but it's his own work and therefore he likes it.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Because we're afraid to give truma ma'aser, it's also for achila for a zar. The fika chol v'aser. The marchum mishum derotza adam kapshalo. This is according to Rav Kana. Harahem becheskes kayamim umuter balabayis lasosin truma ma'aser al perish yesh lo bebeisa. It's a license for the owner to do truma ma'aser because of the kapshalo principle. Yeah. But according to Rav Nachman Yitzchak, says Rashi, my lefika, isa mechira mishumha hu vehechatol etana asiyasa beisa mechira. How can you do? In other words, it seems to be a stira in itself. You can't do truma ma'aser, therefore you can't do truma ma'aser. Doesn't make sense. So he says, Hashid Omar Rabbanan lo tezavim the chashina. Now that the rabbis have said you shouldn't sell it, the chashina. Shema osna hamafke truma harahem becheskes shalom nimkaru. So he's making the statement blanket that it's in a chazaka of you shouldn't sell it. V'osa osna balabayis truma ma'aser. So again, is it the strongest interpretation? Not really, but it's enough of an interpretation that allows Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak to use the lefikach as kind of the hammer as to why you can't sell it, because in the chashinan portion of the selling, we just said you can't sell it. Now that you can't sell it, I'm going to give truma ma'aser. So again, I'm going to tell you, it's not as strong as the interpretation of Rav Kana, but nevertheless, the Gemara says it still fits, and we're going to allow it for Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So that's the machlokes between these two Amoraim in the view of the Tanakama of the Mishnah. So I hope that's a little bit more clear, because now we're going to compound the confusion a little bit more.
Excuse me, Rabbi. Mm-hmm. Why do we assume that when this man brings his stuff, it could be a small amount, depending on the size of his field or whatever, or it could be a half a truckload on a pickup truck? Why do we assume that there's no conversation between the one who's bringing it and the one who's been asked to store? I mean, why wouldn't we assume that the person who's being asked to store this is not asking a question? What's the reason? Why are you doing this?
Well, okay, so you can take the position that maybe most people would ask, but the Gemara is taking the position of what happens if it's just two friends and I come to you and I'm rushing and I say, Jay, do me a favor, hold on to this, don't touch it, don't sell it, don't do anything. And you know me, and you're not asking questions. You see that I have 1 foot out the door, so you don't ask me any questions. This is, of course, Tuvia, I'll do that for you by all means. So we have to account for the fact that he will not articulate to him, I want to give truma ma'aser, I want kab shelo. We have to make that assumption in the worst case scenario that it's two people who know each other, who trust each other, and will do for each other without too many questions. Okay, of course, if you ask questions, you'll know. But what happens if you don't ask questions?
Right. But if somebody's bringing a small amount, whatever, which is kind of hard to figure out, a small amount of truma and ma'aser. But if somebody's bringing a large amount and he has to wheel it in or whatever, it's obvious that this is not going to be a time where a guy says, here's a half a truckload I pulled into your driveway, leave my pickup truck is there, I got to go run to the airport. That seems so far-fetched that they would go through
Well,
all of this dialogue to say that this could happen.
Well, I think the Gemara is taking, again, in the discussion between them. I have to imagine the Amoraim who were around the table or were
Yeah.
discussing this back 2,000 years ago, where we're postulating a scenario that either may have already happened, or it's a Metzias, or something that they felt is a likelihood where two people who know each other are just going to trust each other. That if someone says, "Do me a favor," and hold on to this. Remember, there's not. He didn't make him a shomer. It's a mafkid. He gave him a picotton.
But at the time, there was no intention to raise it to the Truma or Meister level,
Absolutely
which
not.
would create all kinds of
Right? No,
good-
he
good
thought about
shilas
that
to
later.
have.
No, you're absolutely right. He thought about it later and said, "You know what? I can take care of two birds with one stone." I gave him this thing to hold. Very nice. He did me a favor. Now, okay, no questions asked. I'm going to make this, and then he just found out through a messenger that someone wants to buy his field in Connecticut for a large sum of money, and he can't sell it because he didn't give Truma and Meiser. And he says, "You know what? I've got a half a truckload sitting over there with Baruch. I'm going to make that Truma and Meiser, and then you, my Shaliach in Connecticut, sell that whole produce for a bundle of money." Right? That's a real story. He sells it for a bundle of money, makes a lot of money because he's already given the Truma and Meiser here in New York, where Baruch is holding his mashkin.
Doesn't he have to tell Baruch what's going on?
He has, right, and then we're going to see in the Gemara right away. When does he tell Baruch, and how does he tell Baruch? He's got to tell Baruch because for all Baruch knows, this is regular food. It's not Truma and Meiser. So Baruch may be in a quandary if he isn't enlightened what he's holding. So again, the Gemara, the Amoraim are sitting around and postulating all kinds of scenarios that might transpire. To you, it's very simple. Let him just tell him, Baruch, I have all this produce. I want you to hold it for me. I'm going to give it to my Meiser. That's too simple. The Gemara is trying to figure out what happens in a circumstance where you don't tell him how do the pieces fit. That's shot in this Gemara. That's what makes it a little bit more confusing. I agree. Okay, so we now have a machlokes Amoraim in the Tanakama. Now let's move on to the next step. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Comes Rabbi Bar Chana. It says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. You know what? I'm going to explain something to you that's going to further clarify what the machlokes is between Rav Kana and Rav Nachman by Yitzchak. Machlokes in the Mishnah. So in the Mishnah, the Tanakama says you cannot sell it, and there's two Amoraim who explain why you can't sell it. But there is another Manda Amar in the Mishnah called Rav Shimon ben Gamliel who says, of course you can sell it. You go to Bezdin, you tell Bezdin, I've got this produce that belongs to so-and-so, and if I don't do something with it, it's going to spoil, and he's going to lose his money. So according to Shimon Gamliel, the Bezdin gives you license to sell it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chana says in the name of Yochanan, machlokes b'chdei chesroinan. The machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel as to whether you can do something with this produce is only with regard to a deterioration of the goods b'chdei chesronan within the limits of what's normal. So when we learned this we learned this already briefly before, and there's a Gemara a couple of blot away, which we're going to have Mitzvah Shem in a few weeks, which lists different foods, rice, wheat, barley, and what's considered normal shrinkage. In other words, every food shrinks. The rule is that if I give you a pound of something, then over time that pound will become less than a pound because it's normal shrinkage. It dries up, this happens, that happens, whatever. That's a rule. That's a general rule. So Rabbi Bar Chana says in Rabbi Yochanan that the whole machlokes between the Tanakama Rav Shimon Gamliel, as to what to do with produce that is starting to deteriorate, i.e., shrink, dry, whatever, is only bichdeis chasronan, in the limitation of what is normal for that food. So let's just say, for an example, you're holding someone's barley, and someone's barley, the normal shrinkage is 5%. Whatever that happens to be, 5%. So what we're saying is that the machlokes between Rav Meir, the Tanna Kama, and Rav Shimon Gamliel is only in shrinkage of 5%. If it's shrunk 5% or less, the Tanna Kama says, don't touch it. Rav Shimon Gamliel says, go sell it. That's the chiddush of Rabbi Bar Chana and Rabbi Yochanan. That whole machlokes is only if it's within the normal measure of what shrinkage is for that food. Okay, now you see how sophisticated they were starting to think. Okay, so if something shrinks and something will normally shrink, what do? You know what? If it's within the normal range, says the Gemara, then Reb Meir says don't touch it. Shimon Gamliel says sell it. So let's go weiter. Let's see. What happens if the shrinkage is not 5%, it's 10%, which is 5% more than normal? So according to this mandama, Rabbi Bar Chana, Rabbi Yochanan, Divrei Hakol Mochin Bebezdin, even the Tanna Kama, who says don't touch it, will agree to go to Bezdin and sell it. So you see, now we have another layer on this machlokes. The whole machlokes between these two Tanoim is only about shrinkage within the normal realm of what is appropriate. But once you go beyond the normal realm and you hold it, and all of a sudden you see that the shrinkage is 7%, 8%, 9%, He says that even Rav Meir, who believes in what? That you're never supposed to touch it, says, go sell it. Don't let it keep deteriorating beyond the norm. Okay, so that's a chiddush. Now we have to look at the two Amoraim, Rav Kana and Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, and understand how they fit into the picture. Because all we were told here is that that the Tanna Kama would agree. But wait a minute, there are two interpretations in the Tanna Kama. There is Rav Kana's interpretation and Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak's interpretation in the Tanna Kama. Do they all agree? Let's take a look in the Gemara. So, Ad Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Vade Pligi. In the interpretation of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, there certainly is a machlokes. What's the machlokes? Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says that the reason why you don't sell it is because of Truma and Maser. What difference does it make if it is deteriorating in the normal range or in more than the normal range? You're always going to have the problem of Truma and Maser, because let's say I tell you, Baruch, I'm giving you this to hold on to, don't touch it. And Baruch is holding on to it, and he knows that barley up to 5% is normal spoilage, and he sees he says, there's a problem here. This is going to spoil 10%. What do I do? According to Nachman Bar Yitzchak, you can't do anything, even if it's 10 or 12%. Why? Because the problem of Truma and Meiser, remember, you asked a question, Jay, do they communicate? The owner hasn't told Baruch that he's giving Truma and Meiser. But there is a possibility Baruch knows that he might give Truma and Meiser. So what difference is if it's 5% or 7 or 10%? The Truma and Meiser issue still remains. So according to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, he can't abide by this interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan, of Rabbi Bar Chana and Rabbi Yochanan, because excessive deterioration doesn't take away the chashash of selling Truma and Meiser. So, right? So therefore, it's irrelevant. Yeah, Michael.
Rabbi, but you're talking about depletion versus spoilage. So to be able to give Truma and Maser, it has to be of good quality. So if there's the
Also
potential,
the correct percentage.
Hmm.
Truma is 140, 50, or 60.
I understand.
And
But
Meiser
if
is 10%.
but if there's danger of the whole not shipment, but all the crops spoiling,
Yeah,
not that there's depletion, but there is actual spoilage, which will be it'll become rotten and rotten throughout, then it's not going to be Truma Maser, and you're not going to be able to give it. So you have to make a judgment, not because of the 5% depletion versus the 10% depletion, but because it's going to spoil in the entirety and none of it will be any good. So the question is, how does that fit in to this machlokes?
so Michael, you ask a brilliant question, because the Gemara itself, as we go further, really discusses that particular issue as to whether or not we're dealing with a food that will continue to spoil short-term or long-term versus food that when it spoils and rots through and through, and there's no further concern of spoilage. So in other words, you're touching on a good issue which has to be parsed, because you're right. What happens under certain circumstances if the food it starts shrinking or spoiling or whatever it happens to be, and it's beyond a certain percentage? So what does he do with regard to Truma Meiser? So that will depend on the food and how much of the shrinkage is actually going on. So I would say it's a good question. Let's hold it, because in the course of discussing that issue will come up, and we're going to try to understand, is there a chilek between whether it spoils 7% or 10% or through and through or what? In other words, unfortunately, this Baruch has no guidance. No one's given him guidance what to do. Sell it, not sell it, save the money, not save the money. So he's kind of out on a limb, and he's got to make some judgments. So the Gemara, in going through all of this, is going to try to set up a roadmap of how you should be thinking about this if there is spoilage. So Rambam Bar Chana came with a general conclusion that the whole discussion between the Tanna Kama and Shimon Gamliel only applies to, quote, normal attrition, normal shrinkage, spoilage, whatever you want to call it, that it's normal for barley or rice or wheat or grapes or whatever, ta'anim, figs, dates, to have a reduction in quantity, and that's normal. So if it's within the normal range, then Reb Meir says, Tanna Kama says, don't touch it. Reb Shimon Gamliel says, touch it. So in this particular situation, what we're saying is that if we apply this principle to Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak, who says the only reason it has to do with Trumas and Meisers, then we haven't really given him any guidance, because Truma and Meiser can be given when it's a little bit more or a little bit less. In other words, you don't have to say, Michael, that the amount of produce that he gave Baruch is exactly 10% of the amount that's in Connecticut. It could have been more. So if there's shrinkage, it won't hurt the 10%. It won't hurt in other words, the quantity of Meiser, or it won't hurt the quantity of Truma. There's enough there to cover Truma Meiser, even if there is shrinkage. Let's just say that's the case. So then the Gemara says, if that's the case, then Reb Nachman then Rambam bar Chana's principle can't apply to Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak, because even if you say that the shrinkage is more than what would be considered the normal for that particular, let's say for barley, we still have the problem of Truma and Meiser, because who cares if it shrank 7%, 8%? He still has more than enough to give Truma and Meiser for the produce in Connecticut. So there's no reason to worry about it. That's what the Gemara said. You can't mollify or pacify or explain away Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak by saying that the machlokes is only if it is within the realm of the normal shrinkage. Because even if it isn't within the realm of normal shrinkage, he still can give away Truma and Maser, and Baruch, who's holding on to it, won't even know. Now, that's the other question that was asked. Are we going to tell Baruch? Well, yeah, I mean, Baruch will find out at some point. We're going to get to that. But right now, Baruch in his mind knows, oh, my friend has a big produce in Connecticut. For all I know, he's going to give Truma and Meiser, and he's going to tell me later that he gave Truma and Meiser. But he instructed me not to sell it. So I'm going to listen to him and not sell it in case, just in the event that he gives Truma and Meiser from the food that I'm holding. So Baruch is smart enough to know I'm not taking chances, because my good friend Ruvain gave me this food to hold, and I'm not going to sell it because maybe he's going to give Truma Meiser, even though the shrinkage is greater than the 5%, which is normal for this food. Okay, so that's how we have to think about that.
Hey, Rabbi,
Yeah.
what would happen instead of talking about Truma and Misa? Aren't we concerned that he might give it as a matana, somebody else, and we're not involved with the whole Truma and Misa story?
I think we're picking Truma and Meiser because we're talking about Heter and Isser. You're right. It could be a matana. It could be a matana.
Would that change anything?
Not really, because, well, it would change because Truma and Meiser is midaraisa. So a matana, okay, I made a mistake and I gave
As far as the one that's holding it, does anything change?
No.
Because
no, but he has to
tell him he wants to give it as a gift, but later on the way back, he sends him a note. Oh, by the way, I want to give this stuff to my cousin.
Right. So Baruch is a nice guy, but he's smart enough. He knows halachas, and he said, you know what? I was told not to touch this. I don't know if my friend wants to give a matana, or he wants to give it as a Yerusha, or he wants to give it as Truma and Meiser. In other words, he's got to cover all bases. I was told, hold on to it, don't do anything with it. I'm not touching it. You're right, it could be a matana, but we're talking about Heter and Isser, which is even more serious. In other words, what do you do with Heter and Isser? Because it's one thing for me to give a matana and someone else is using my matana. It's something else if I'm a non-Kohen to eat Teva, or to eat Truma and Masa. What happens if this is Truma and Masa, and then he gives it to you, Jay, and you're Yisrael, and you're going to start eating Truma and Masa? I mean, now we're talking more heavy duty. So again, the Gemara is trying to give us a flavor here of sort of, let's call it the worst case scenario of what could happen because it's Truma and Masa. Okay, so according to Rama Bar Chana, it makes no difference in Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. But Rav Kana Milei Mepliga. But there's a question here. But according to Rav Kana, who says that the whole principle is Kav Shalo, is there a machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak? So we will say, Ki ka'amar Rav Kana b'chdei kesarin kama v'harotza b'kav shalo metisha kavan shel chavero. In other words, maybe we'll say, you know what? Rav Kana takes the position that a person wants kav shalom metisha kavan shel chavero. But wait a minute. You know when he says that? When there's normal shrinkage. If there's abnormal shrinkage, then he'll say, you know what? I'm not such a big chassid of kav shalom that I'm willing to lose half my produce. If it starts deteriorating more than what should deteriorate, I'm going to capitulate and I'm going to say, sell it, because I don't want to lose that much money. In other words, I'm a good guy. I like my own produce, but I don't like it so much that I'm willing to give up a loss of half of my produce because I'm stubborn and I want to keep kav shalom. So the Gemara's question is, does Rav Kana believe in this? Maybe Rav Kana will cave in, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan view that this machlokes is only by normal shrinkage. How do we know? We know with Rabbi Yitzchak it doesn't matter because he can sell Truma Maisa anyway. But will Rav Kana, who says Kav Shalom, will he agree, or will he cave in and say, no, if it's with a normal shrinkage, I'm all for Kav Shalom. But if it's more than normal shrinkage, I'm on board to sell it and not lose more money. So we don't know. In other words, that's the kasha. We don't know what his view, what Rav Kana's view would be in that situation. Does he abide by Rama Bar Chana's Yochanan's principle? And he says, okay, it deteriorated only 5%, I'm okay, or no, or does he say 6-7%? Sell it. It's like the guy on the stock market who tells his broker to put a stop order at a certain number, or he says, use your judgment. If it reaches a certain number, sell. So, but poor Baruch has to make a decision here. Okay, he gave me license to sell. Is it time to sell? Should I now sell because it's gone beyond the 5% mark? So that's the kasha. So in Rav Kana, we asked the kasha, what's the pshat in Rav Kana as to whether or not he would agree or not agree. So the Gemara answers very interestingly, and the Gemara says, Guzma ba'alma. What does that mean? That when Rav Kana said, don't sell because of Kav Shalo, and he said, let's say 5%, then it was just, a Guzma means an exaggeration. But here he means to say, that was just, he threw out a number. He says, Guzma ba'alma, that was just a number, 5%. So we have to extrapolate that if it's more than the 5%, that he would agree that you can sell it. So that's the interpretation. So in other words, we have a machlokes between Rav Kana and Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak in Rami bar Chana and Rabbi Yochanan. According to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, it doesn't matter if it even if it deteriorated more than the norm, then you still shouldn't sell it because we're afraid he will designate Truma Masa. But according to Rav Kana, who says that Kav Shalo, the Gemara says, when Kav Shalo works, when it is within the normal range. If it goes beyond the normal range, then it's not such a Kav Shalo, no matter what percentage. If it's already shrinking beyond what would be considered reasonable, then he'll cave in and he'll say, go ahead and sell it. So that's how the Gemara wants to apply the machlokes of Rav Kana and Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak in Rami bar Chama and Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation. So let's take a look at Rashi. That's why I say we have several layers here, which last time was a little confusing how we apply them. So let's take a look. It says Rashi, machlokes the misnisim b'chadei chesroinon kederech shar tevuos k'moshe porish b'mishnah zena, like we learned later on in our Gemara and Mem, lechitin laores tisha chatzi kaben lakur. For wheat and for orez and rice, we say it's 9.5 kaben lakur. For grapes and te'anim, it could be more, it could be less. So in other words, that's considered the norm. But even the Rabbanan, he means the Mayor here, but even the Rabbanan say you can sell it if it deteriorates more than the norm. So in Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Vadai Pliga, here look at Rashi, Hod Rabbi Yochanan, if we're really concerned that the owner will make a truma, then you can't sell it even if it is 10%, 15% spoiled, because you're always worried he's going to do truma and meiser, and he's not going to he won't tell his friend Baruch till later. In other words, he's going to go ahead and sell it. Baruch is going to be holding on to this produce, and if you don't give Baruch instruction, don't touch it, then he may say on his own, you know what, it's 15% spoiled. I'm going to quickly get rid of this to save my friend money. And in the meantime, he's already made a Truma and Maser. So Baruch unwittingly is going to sell Truma and Maser to a Yisrael to do his friend a favor, and he's going to turn out to be an Isser, right? That's the concern here, is that he's going to be a good guy and he's going to go ahead and sell it. But meantime, the owner already made it Truma and Masa because he is allowed. So that's Pshat Pliga. He can't apply Rami bar Chama Rabbi Yochanan's principle here. But we asked the Kasha.
So the owner can be traveling to Europe.
Right.
On the plane, he decides, you know what, I'm going to make that Truma Misa.
Right.
He doesn't communicate it.
Right.
And the good guy has a problem.
Right. Of course, in the 2nd century, in the time of the Amoraim, they weren't traveling by plane. But you're right. If you can't communicate with him, then something bad is going to happen, which is why we say to Baruch, don't touch it. Don't
Until you hear from him.
because until you hear from him, you don't know what he's doing. You're
Right.
doing him a favor by keeping it in your silo, but you don't know what he's doing.
But then he has to assume that the owner knows it's spoiling every day. He doesn't do something about it.
Again, we're gonna the amount of spoilage issue which Michael raised is gonna come up. In other words, what assumption do we make that the balabos knows how much spoilage is going on? That's a good question, and the Gemara is going to touch on that, because you're right. Maybe he's fearful that the spoilage is going to increase too quickly, so he quickly wants to sell it as truma and meiser, get it out of his possession, let somebody else deal with it. Okay,
So
again, that's a complication. We don't know it.
So the problem gets shifted back and forth between Baruch, who's
And
doing a good guy,
Right?
and the owner who's on a trip to Hawaii.
Exactly right. And the guy who's on the trip to Hawaii has to make all the decisions, and Baruch has to do nothing. That's why we're saying Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is not, his view is not altered whatsoever by Rami bar Chama and Rabbi Yochanan, because it doesn't matter whether it's the normal shrinkage or abnormal shrinkage. The problem of Truma and Maisa always remains.
Yeah, so Baruch is actually a Shomer Chinam, right?
Shomer Chinam.
Fully, with all the regular
Absolutely.
rules about Shomer Chinam.
Absolutely. He's a full Shomer Chinam, and he has no wiggle room. There's no wiggle room. So okay, so that's the Rashi. Now the Rashi goes on and says, Milema Pliga. In Rav Kana, is there we don't know. Is there a machlekes? Dafka Amar Rav Kana, Im Tisha Kabin Hey Noach Lo, that 9 kabin he'd rather give up. Sheyavdu Ad Kav Al Yamachram the Havale Yosem Miftei Chesronim Upliga Had Rabbi Yochanan Leo. Do we say that Rabbi Yochanan actually changes Rav Kana's view, or lav? Dafka Tisha Kabin Nocket. He picked 9 kabin. He doesn't mind if it's a ratio of 1 to 9 if there's a little bit damage. But once it starts getting damaged more than a kav, he's off to the races, and he's telling this buddy, you make sure that you sell this, because now I'm a fair weather guy. I like my own stuff, but I don't like it so much that I'm willing to give up tons of my own produce for it. If I can salvage 90% of my produce, which I normally wouldn't, I'd rather have my own 10, but if it's going to be 80%, 70%, all of a sudden he's in trouble. And if he's in trouble, then he's going to cave in. We don't know that. So the Gemara says, that's what the Gemara says, Guzma, Sefes Yeser. It's a throwaway. In other words, he says Kav Shalom, meaning 10%. He doesn't mean that he'll do it for more than 10%. So that's the machlokes now here in this pshat, and it's fascinating because you see that with each layer it becomes more complicated. So we're going to stop. Okay, so now that hopefully we're going to refresh our recollection, we've now set the ground rules. So Mitchum, next week when we start Mesaveh and talking about the prices, we're going to refer back to this Mishnah. We're going to try to answer the questions that came up today, good questions about what do we do under different circumstances, and do we allow him to sell or not allow him to sell. But you see that in the time of the Gemara, when, again, you see several things. You see how people valued property, right? How they valued property, because according to Tanakama, according to Rav Kana, my property is more valuable than anything else. But you also see that people were practical. There was a certain practicality that meant that, you know what? I can abide by some loss, but I can't abide by a major loss. So if it's a major loss, I have to think differently than if it's only a small loss. But on the part of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, who worries about the Truma and Maser issue, that issue doesn't go away just because it's spoiled more than 5%, because he's sitting on his yacht, wherever it is in Hawaii, and he's saying, I'm going to sell this for Truma Masa. I'm going to designate this Truma Masa. And poor Baruch doesn't really know what's going on. So again, it gives us a little bit of a flavor of how they were interacting. So next week we'll pick up from this Mesave, and we'll go further and sort of elucidate our discussion. So hopefully we've now set the table here a little bit better as to what the different machlokes are. Now the rest of it should flow into that.
Yeah, Shikoach.
Yashkoach, Rabbi.
Okay, it's a
Good
fascinating
week.
Gemara, and hopefully we'll in the next week or maybe two, but then we'll get into the further